Hello everyone, my name is Dr.Fr.Pascal Kabura. I want to spend a few minutes to talk about domestic violence and its impact on our families, on our community, and on our country, and especially as it affects the most vulnerable members of our society, namely children and women. There has been a lot of talk in the recent past about domestic violence. Many organizations, including even government, they've been trying, the churches, they've been trying to see how we can understand the impact of domestic violence on our society, especially on the vulnerable members of our communities. First, let us look at what domestic violence is. Of course, the word domestic means at home. And violence is anything that disrupts the normal functioning of the person caused by another person. Domestic violence, that is violence in the home, may take forms of physical violence, which include beating, pushing, pulling, throwing objects, and things like that, punching. It can also take emotional violence, emotional form, whereby any action, any word, any form of deprivation affects the well-being emotionally of another person. In this case, it could take verbal abuse, words of discouragement, despising, criticizing, downplaying someone's achievements. All that is a form of violence, but it's not physical, but rather emotional. In other words, it affects the feelings of another person, the affect of another person. In the recent past, like I just said, many organizations and many government agencies have taken time to sensitize and educate people on the negative impact of domestic violence in our homes. Domestic violence has been here since time immemorial. Unfortunately, it's only in the recent times that people have started realizing that domestic violence, physical or emotional or deprivational, causes a number of negative things on members of the family, which we call a domestic, somewhere where someone lives. Children often suffer physical violence where they are beaten, they are slapped, they are pushed, objects are thrown at them. That's physical violence. But can also be emotional in a sense that children are abused verbally, criticized, shouted at, frightened, and sometimes exposed to things that are scaring, exposed to fights, exposed to adult sexual behavior. In that sense, then they are violated. That's a form of violence. Another form of violence in homes is deprivation. children, men and women are supposed to be catered for, to share the resources. Take, for example, children. They're supposed to be fed, they're supposed to be clothed, they're supposed to be protected, and they're supposed to be given attention. When children are deprived of attention, they are deprived of food, deprived of clothes, deprived of care, not supported. That's a form of violence. It's not physical, it's emotional, but may not necessarily be fully emotional, but it is a form of deprivation, a violation of their rights, because children have got a right to be catered for, to be fed, to be clothed, to be loved. And when they are deprived of that, it is a form of violence. Sometimes children are violated because of the conflicts that exist between men and women, between husbands and wives, between fathers and mothers. And then the children are sandwiched. They are caught in between. There are some men who stop providing for their children just because there is a conflict between him and his wife. Children also suffer emotional violence when they witness fights, when they witness exchange of bad words. The children become victims, and therefore they suffer violence when their parents are fighting. Now, when all this is happening, we must also be aware, especially with children, that depending on their age, this exposure to violence or experience of violence itself disrupts their normal development, their normal growth. Remember, children as children, regardless of age, they are still very vulnerable. Their brains are still growing, their bodies are still very weak, and whatever form of violence, whether physical, emotional, or sometimes sexual, it affects their development. It hampers their development. Take a few examples. Children who are physically punished several times, those children develop to become violent because they see violence, physical violence, being beaten as the only way of solving problems. So children who are physically violated, physically punished, they are likely to become also abusers of other children, to become violent, to fight, because they learn with the time, they learn that fighting, beating is the way of solving their problems. So long term, physical violence of children creates a violent society. It creates men who are violent, women who are violent. Research after research has shown that children who have been corporally punished, beaten, they are more likely to become violent adults. Children who have been deprived, who have not been given enough food, properly fed, or who have been unjustly treated in homes, they are more likely than other children to grow into adults who are going to be depriving others of their rights, violating other people's rights, and repeating exactly what they went through. So children physically or emotionally or sexually violated is a very terrible thing which hampers their development as mature men, mature women. At the emotional level, when children are experience domestic violence, especially from their parents, their mothers, caregivers, stepmothers, stepfathers. They may develop a low self-esteem because when children are still young, they look on to the adult, the mother, the father, as a kind of God, as a perfect person. So whatever father says, whatever mother says at a certain age is taken for gospel truth. If mother says you are foolish, they believe it. If dad says you will grow up to become hopeless, they take it to be true. And they, like a sponge, those words of discouragement, those words are swallowed. And when they are swallowed, they are digested and they formulate the internal self definition of a person. If dad, who is a God, says, I am foolish, I am foolish, it keeps ringing in their mind, I'm foolish and foolish. And eventually, it works on a child's development of identifying themselves, defining themselves as foolish. So, as an adult man or an adult woman, they have that voice of dad, that voice of mom, from the time when they were 4 years old, 5 years old, saying, you're foolish, you're foolish, you're foolish, you're foolish, you are dense, there's nothing good about you, you're ugly, those comments, you will never succeed. So, as a result of that, it works on their own self-esteem, which can be defined as self-definition. So they see themselves as what they have been described by their God at that time, the parent, the mother, or the father. Long-term impact on the child, especially emotional violence, verbal abuse, long-term effect is terrible. So many of the men and women you see who lack self-confidence, some of them, I'm not saying everybody, some of them, it's a result of that swallowed in verbal abuse, criticism, which has been adopted to become a language of self-definition.